Right, so we're going to do a video dealing with two very summative topics on Brave New World. Really, two things we want to look at is a little bit of Huxley's background as far as his background in science and his connections and networks, and wondering whether or not he actually had the applicable ideas to write Brave New World and he had the education for it. I mean, obviously he wrote it, but was what he writing elements of the fantastic, or was he really trying to do something more? That's a big question that a lot of people deal with as they read and also write criticism of A Brave New World. And then secondly, we want to look at some of the overarching issues that Brave New World brings um, into light for discussion, and sort of just to get you thinking on this level as we begin moving and talking and thinking about Brave New World. So Huxley explores three themes in Brave New World. The first is the rise of consumerism. The second is the dangers of genetic engineering. And thirdly, the potential of misuse of power in the hands of the scientific bureaucrat or technocrat. And so we really want to think about those three areas as we continue in this video and in other videos of our discussion of Brave New World. Okay, so because the heart of his novel revolves around whether or not the science for what he's creating is legitimate, students really have to discern whether or not Huxley had the scientific knowledge to make his book realistic. And so let's look at some of his background and let's discuss whether or not that's actually fitting for Huxley to have written this novel. Huxley was born into a very intellectual and scientific family. His grandfather, Thomas Huxley, was a supporter and a contemporary with Darwin, and wrote his own book called Evidence on a Man's Place in Nature. And that presented evidence for human evolution as well. This was being the topic that Darwin actually had avoided around this time. Huxley surrounded himself with famous men of science and philosophy. He studied broadly and he founded a formidable dynasty of intellectually and scientifically minded descendants. So the Huxley family, from the get-go, not only are they have really great hair and chops, they also were scientifically and intellectually focused. So Aldous's father, Leonard Huxley, was not an established scientist, but he did understand the concepts enough to be a recognized biographer of his father and of Darwin. Leonard married Julia Arnold, who came from an intellectual family herself. She was the sister of a novelist, niece of the poet Matthew Arnold, and granddaughter of the famous educator Thomas Arnold. This is actually a picture of them. This is the only one I could find of Julia Arnold anywhere. I think she's a lot younger here. But this photo, interestingly enough, was taken by Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So kind of odd and interesting. Coincidence? Sure. Or not. Who knows? Then you have Julian Huxley, Leonard and Julia's oldest son, Julian, so Aldous' brother. And he became a prominent scientist in the 20th century, following in his grandfather's footsteps. So while Aldous was penning Brave New World, his treatise on how science may affect human life, Julian was similarly studying concepts of evolution and growth, dealing with them in the light of philosophic problems generated by the scientific developments that were happening at that time. He also made important connections between genetics and evolution, and he even became knighted for his advancement. So after the death of his first wife, Julia, Leonard remarried, and then his first son by this new marriage was Andrew F. Huxley. Now he looks more Russian than the rest of them did. But in 1963, he became a Nobel laureate in physiology or medicine. And then in 1932, the year that Aldous' Brave New World was published, Andrew went to Cambridge planning to major in the physical sciences. An extra course in physiology actually started him on the professional path that led to the collaborations that would in turn give him his Nobel Prize. Huxley himself obviously grew up in a family of intellectual elite in England, and this likely affected his own life and his writing. Huxley had avidly studied science as a child, though he was prevented from becoming a surgeon by an eye illness that left him nearly blind. Eventually, his family history and scientific interests, as well as some moral obligation to fight the class instituted slavery he saw around him, were evidenced in his writing, especially, of course, Brave New World that we are looking at now. As an adult, Huxley also had some very impressive friends. That included the 20th century geneticist J.B.S. Haldane. Haldane was an innovative pioneer, especially in population genetics, and his brilliance helped define the field and reshape modern evolutionary biology. He also published work of fiction, Deadlist, which he discussed the scientific possibility of test tube and ectogenic babies, as you can already see as it's connected to Brave New World. So we already have that discussion going on as you've been reading the book. So you can see these direct connections to Aldous Huxley and the influence of his life all around. Whether or not that has given him enough credit in your thoughts on whether or not he is a scientifically viable candidate to write such a book, and if the science within the book is viable itself, that's another question. But that is the ideas that I leave to you. So, science itself does have a sustained presence in Huxley's text. It's very crucial on the plot. The methods, the ideas, the practitioners, all of these are featured prominently throughout the novel. And Huxley even sets out to predict what would happen if the scientific method were applied to an entire culture. And so he begins to look at that. And so his text has been interpreted both as a prediction and also a warning for the possibilities of the future. Now, we want to spend some time, we want to think about some of these thematic topics that allow us, or Huxley's texts allow us to consider now. And kind of just to get your brain going in a general state of, well, how are we to think about this, especially in a time like this where there's really a lot of need for science and culture to sort of be applied, and questions of ethical identity are also really needed to be understood throughout our culture and honestly throughout the world itself. Huxley himself stated that the theme of Brave New World was the advancement of science as it affects human individuals. Scientific advances that are specifically described are those involving the application to human beings of the results of future research in biology, physiology, and psychology. So in other words, he wants to know what happens when you take science and put it on people, and how does it affect them? How does the application of it happen? Very similar to something like Jurassic World. Michael Crichton basically almost steals the entire idea here and puts it in a different context with dinosaurs. So the big thing here is that the conflict is not so much some sort of crazy, physical war, but more of a scientific war happening within the text through ectogenesis, neo-Pavlovian conditioning, and hypnopaedia. And of course, the use of soma. So we'll talk about that. Remember that it's described as having all the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, but none of their effects. That's sort of a holiday from reality, if you will. That's what soma is described as. And so we have to ask is that true? And does soma represent sort of the entire culture as it is in the book? So the first thing we want to talk about is in vitro fertilization, and that's what we call assisted reproduction. I don't know why there's not a first quotation there. It's my bad. So Huxley had obviously been thinking about ectogenesis, and that's the creation of mammalian life outside of the womb. And he thought about this long before Brave New World. In his 1922 novel, Chrome Yellow, the philosophic character, Mr. Scogan, begins discussing this. And he talks about where the world may be heading. And he talks about this sort of impersonal generation and how that's going to take the place of nature's system of doing it, and this sort of vast incubation, rows upon rows of bottles, and and how the population will then be created. And then in Brave New World, Huxley creates this world in which ectogenesis and test tube babies are taken for granted, and they have been for hundreds of years after Ford. So in our society, in vitro fertilization is developed not to be able to mass produce children, as in Huxley's world, but to assist women whose oviducts were blocked or were not able to have kids to be able to have children. Female reproductive cells are typically surgically removed following hormonal stimulation of the follicles. And then it's fertilized in a laboratory before being placed back in the uterus and allowed to be implanted. This procedure also has a very high rate of success, and embryos can be frozen for later use if the first attempt is not successful. So even more controversial than in vitro fertilization is the idea of cloning, and that's similar to Huxley's idea of BOKANOVSKIFICATIon. It's a hard word to say, I know, especially since it's often the word that's used loosely in debates and about which the public knows little. Though our world does not mass produce children, as does the world state in Brave New World, there are aspects of current research where parallels can be seen. Reproductive and therapeutic cloning can both be linked to Brave New World, since the world state creates beings and has practically eliminated dying from disease. Scientists have also been discussing the potential of cloning for years. James Bonner at CIT told a seminar of science writers that it would be possible in the not too distant future to produce a master race of super babies called clones by growing them in labs. Though most scientists would agree that these super babies are not an impending threat, the media and politicians typically generalize and exaggerate enough that our students are not sure what is possible or not possible when it comes to cloning. So it's important for you to grasp. Cloning has a lot of ethical and moral debates, and you need to understand a lot of these ideas. So the cloning that most people think of when they hear the word is reproductive cloning, which is used to generate an animal that has the same nuclear DNA as another existing animal. That's the idea of Dolly the sheep, right? But it's expensive and it's also ineffective. The animals that donated the adult cells are, only mostly replicated. Only the clone's chromosomal or nuclear DNA is the same as the donor. So some of the clone's materials come from mitochondria in the cytoplasm of an egg. Mitochondria, which are organelles that serve as power sources to the cell, contain their own short segments of DNA. In other words, you are not creating the exact clone of something. There are parts of it that are, but it's not an exact replica. So reproductive cloning is really highly misunderstood, and it's considered to be that, sort of almost sci-fi movie-ish form of cloning. On the surface, it appears very similar to the Bokanovsky process. But this mitochondrial DNA and the mutations that appear to disallow the Bokanovsky process from actually occurring. But if there were rates of success that were improved, remember that Dolly, the sheep, was only one success out of 276 tries. Now imagine doing that with a human, which is so much more difficult. Reproductive cloning can be used to develop efficient ways to reliably reproduce animals with special qualities. Drug-producing animals or animals that have been genetically altered to serve as models for human disease could be mass-produced. We also see this with things like genetic modification in vegetables, gigantic tomatoes, things like that. And there's a whole other area of ethical debate there is, are GMOs a big deal or are they not? And maybe it's both. Maybe it is a big deal sometimes, maybe it's not in others. That's something that we'll need to be considering. So another kind of cloning that we want to talk about is therapeutic cloning. And this is where we produce human embryos for use in research, not to create cloned human beings, but to harvest stem cells that can be used to study human development and treat disease. Unlike Huxley's Bokanovskified embryos, the embryos used in therapeutic cloning are destroyed when stem cells are extracted from the egg after it has divided. So therapeutic cloning technology and may someday be used in humans to produce entire organs or single cells or to produce healthy cells that can replace damaged cells in degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. In fact, right now, I know we're dealing with a time of dealing with a virus right now, and that's why we're having these online classes. But if you look at news right now, there have been now 2 cases of HIV positive people being completely cured from this sort of therapeutic cloning and stem cell process. This is a huge deal for science. So this is not that far away and um, not that so distant in the future that we're not able to create organs or anything now, but it's very close, right? So we're coming close to that time period. Creating healthy people is a big part of the stem cell and this idea of therapeutic cloning research. However, it does have its own sense of ethics to it. Are we okay with all types of cloning and one type of cloning? What's the idea here that's focused on? These are things that I'll be wanting you to be thinking through. Remember that Huxley's social stability was artificial. The upper echelons of society are able to afford to rid their offspring of diseases, and they are creating more, worry-free alphas and betas. But the less fortunate, the deltas and the epsilons, are going to have tougher lives. They're conditioned that way. So I want to say just a few things about stem cells then, as we need to think about stem cells now. This is a huge deal. Stem cells came in pretty much when under the Bush presidency, so about a decade and a half ago. Um, Bush wouldn't use stem cells and do stem cell research, and because of that, even now, America is really behind in stem cell research. Now, this is not a good thing, but then maybe it is a good thing. There are real ethical questions that we want to think about, and a lot of misinformation that's out there about stem cells. So, stem cells basically are cells that have the potential to develop into multiple cell types in the human body. They can theoretically divide an unlimited amount of times to replenish other cells in the body. So, what's so amazing to the general public is that when a stem cell divides, each new cell has the potential to either remain a stem cell or become another type of cell with a more specialized function. So, anything from a muscle cell to a red blood cell. The controversy, though, comes primarily from lack of understanding. The general public hears words like embryonic stem cells, and basically what they picture is mad scientists, like out of Frankenstein or something like that, stealing cells from the babies, or maybe people aborting babies and then harvesting cells from those babies. When in fact, embryonic stem cells come from embryos that develop from eggs that have been fertilized in vitro and in an in vitro fertilization clinic, and then they're donated for research purposes with informed consent of the donors. They are not derived from eggs fertilized in a woman's body. So, studying these cells, what does it do? Well, it helps us understand information about complex events that occur in human development. And in turn, it also helps us understand things like cancer and different ways of possible therapy. And as we just talked about, a cure for HIV, it seems. All right, so we also want to talk about eugenics and designer babies. Are we creating better beings by doing this? So parents and doctors can now screen embryos for genetic disorders, but according to Design a Baby, the fear that is in the future we may be able to use these technologies to modify the embryos and choose desirable and cosmetic characteristics. by the way, journalists came up with that idea, not scientists. There is this fear that if gene therapy leads up to its promise, parents will someday be able to go beyond weeding out undesirable traits and start actually inserting the genes they want. Before this millennium is many years old, parents may actually be going to fertility clinics and picking up a list of options the way car buyers or order air conditioning. Well, we're not there yet. Okay, we're not at that process yet. Um, a lot of this is just to make sure the embryo is healthy, and even then, you have real ethical concerns. Who has a right to life? People that have disabilities and those ideas come into play here. So it's definitely a question that we need to think. So the world state controls whose genes are used to create babies and who's born sterile, since they deem fertility as a sense of nuisance. And approximately 70% of the female embryos also receive the male sex hormones in Brave New World periodically, so that they are decanted as free martins. In other words, they're sterile. And this brings the world state out of the realm of what they call mere slavish imitation of nature into a much more interesting world of human invention. In this manner, the government completely controls the population of the entire world, because the government decides which ovaries are allowed to be used for reproduction. And that's always in the factories. And we'll talk much more about this and how this is actually a sort of the creation of population, the creation of babies is part of the family unit, something that the world state will not want to have happen and not want to be active in order to create a sense of stability and control within the culture and the society at large. So Huxley also hinted at the beneficial methods of population control in his book Chrome Yellow. Remember, Mr. Scogin, that we talked about earlier in this video, states that he says that the goddess of applied science has presented the world with another gift, more precious even than cinema and pistols, the means of disassociating love for propagation. Eros, for those who wish it, is now an entirely free god. His deplorable associations with Lucina, that's the Roman goddess of childbirth, may be broken at will. In the course of the next few centuries, who knows, the world may see more complete severance. Okay, so once again, we see this sort of idea that Huxley is bringing in of that separation of love and child rearing, and this separation of relationship with the children. So obviously, Huxley's not a big fan of this. If you're reading Brave New World, you can tell that he's very much not for this, but using it to think on a deeper level. So similarly, while the fertile women in Brave New World must follow the strict regimen of birth control medications, they call this the Malthusian drill. Mary, a progressive young woman in Chrome Yellow, tries to talk to a woman who had 3 children in 31 months, and she tells her about the Malthusian League. So, what is this Malthusian idea? Well, that comes from Thomas Malthus, and he was an English economist who was known for his theory of population growth, and he said that basically population growth is going to always outrun the food supply, and so for the betterment of humankind, it's impossible unless we limit reproduction. So this is commonly thought of as Malthusianism. Huxley, like Malthus, was concerned about the effects of overpopulation on society, though Chrome, Yellow, and Brave New World address methods of Malthusian birth control. In reality, birth control depends on the cooperation of the entire people. That's what Huxley says, Brave New World Revisited. So his discussion on population then grows. He's worried about the population growing at a faster rate than others, and children in many cases not being adequately housed, educated, or fed. And so this is a big question. What do we do for population control? Is there an innate right to be able to have children? Should a woman who cannot care for her children be able to have 30 children? Should a couple that does that be able to have 30 children? Should they be able to start a farm, a cult, whatever it is? Who knows? So this is a big question that we ethically want to be thinking about as well. Also, the overuse of legal drugs in society. Remember, Huxley creates Soma, which is the perfect drugs, has no negative ramifications. So Western society is sort of also on this quest to create perfect drugs. Anyone who watches television has been inundated with so many advertisements about medications that claim to improve the quality of life in some way. Typically at the end they list about 40 or 50 different side effects that may possibly kill you, and then that's what happens at the end of the commercial. And then, of course, in the 1960s, many people were on a quest to find, you know, sort of the pharmacological effect of psychedelics, including Huxley, as you can read in his essays, The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, trying to figure out exactly what's happening to the mind in those places. Is this a good thing? Can we pharmacologically get away from reality? So in Brave New World, science believes that happiness consists in catering to the physical and physiological needs, and only the psychological need it recognizes is the need to fill up leisure and avoid boredom. This is fulfilled through games and the feelies and, of course, soma ration. And then last, of course, is social behavior, and animals are not quite last, I don't think. One of the main tenets of Brave New World is social stability. Simply no civilization can be in existence without social stability. And there's no social stability without individual stability. So Bokanovsky groups in the novel behave like some sort of altruistic animal. They behave in ways that reduce their individual possibilities of reproduction and increase the possibilities in the recipient of a behavior. So whereas the lower caste Bokanovsky groups toil for the good of the overall society. In other words, the idea of people fulfilling their roles, people doing what they should do because it's socially good for the rest of everybody else. In fact, even in the upper castes and Brave New Worlds, we see this happening. People are kind of sent around to be like worker bees, and they are doing what they, are made to do, even though they are the highest of the high. Even when they're creating other beings, even when they're creating gammas or deltas or epsilons, they're still enjoying this process of doing their work. They're doing their place. They're still in their placement of society, and it's really the same as it would be for a delta epsilon whatever, even though it appears to us, since we are looking down on that as a reader, to be different. And I mean, it is different, but in theory, the sense of them is sameness. And then last, of course, we want to talk about behavioral condition. So there's a lot of behavioral and social conditioning in Huxley's Brave New World, especially through the sleep teaching idea of hypnopaedia. It's also called a moralizing and socializing force. And so basically this idea of training people through their sleep processes, and then also how do you train them through books, loud noises, the flowers, shocks, all these things happening. These are all forms of behavior conditioning. Definitely recommend looking up a few articles by B.F. Skinner and noticing Huxley being reflected in a lot of that work. So that's some of the bigger topics that we want to talk about and we want to consider in Brave New World as we continue on in this process. Quite a bit of different things to think about and think through. Maybe a little bit overwhelming at this point, but in general, just looking at these overarching ideas and ethical questions that are worth considering, not only as we study the novel, but as we think through how we as individuals come to understand life, come to understand people's rights, come to understand different ethical identities within fields of learning and education and issues like that. All right. So until the next video, we'll see you later.